The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Marcus Chen adjusted his worn baseball cap and pulled his oversized hoodie closer around his thin frame. At 19, he looked even younger, his smooth face and slight build making him appear more like a high school student than someone about to enter one of the city's busiest courtrooms. The heavy wooden doors of the municipal building loomed before him, their brass handles polished to a gleaming shine that reflected his nervous expression. Marcus had been planning this day for months, ever since he graduated from law school, at the unprecedented age of 18. His photographic memory and exceptional analytical skills had allowed him to complete his undergraduate degree in 2 years and law school in another 2, making him one of the youngest licensed attorneys in state history. But despite his impressive credentials, no law firm would take him seriously. Every interview ended the same way, with senior partners politely suggesting he gain some life experience before practicing law. The rejection had stung, but it also sparked an idea that had been growing in his mind for weeks. What if the legal system's bias against young people extended beyond job interviews? What if judges and court officials treated young defendants differently simply because of their age and appearance? Marcus decided to find out firsthand by conducting an undercover investigation that would either validate or challenge his suspicions. He had carefully crafted his disguise over several weeks, studying how teenagers dressed and spoke when they appeared in court. His usually neat hair was now deliberately messy, and he had practiced slouching and using casual language that would make him blend in with typical young defendants. The baggy clothes and worn sneakers completed the transformation, making him look like just another troubled teen who had run afoul of the law. The case Marcus had chosen was perfect for his experiment, a minor traffic violation that had escalated due to a missed court date. The original defendant had been a college student who couldn't afford to take time off work for court appearances. Marcus had quietly arranged to represent him pro bono, though the court records would show only that a Marcus Chen was handling the case. He had deliberately omitted his title and credentials from all paperwork, knowing that most people would assume he was the defendant rather than the attorney. Inside the courthouse, the familiar sounds of the legal system filled the air. The clicking of heels on marble floors, hushed conversations between lawyers and clients, and the occasional bang of a gavel from various courtrooms. Marcus made his way through the metal detector, noting how the security guards barely glanced at him, their attention focused on more formally dressed individuals, who looked like they belonged in this setting. The waiting area outside courtroom B was filled with the usual mix of people found in municipal court, some in business suits, accompanied by their attorneys, others in casual clothes looking nervous and alone. Marcus took a seat on one of the hard wooden benches and observed the interactions around him. He watched as court clerks treated well-dressed individuals with obvious respect while speaking more curtly to those who appeared to be representing themselves, or who looked young and inexperienced. As he waited for his case to be called, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. Born to immigrant parents who had worked multiple jobs to support his education, he had always felt the weight of their sacrifices and expectations. His father, a restaurant cook, and his mother, a hospital janitor, had never attended college themselves but had instilled in him a deep respect for education and justice. They had been incredibly proud when he passed the bar exam, though they worried about his youth and the challenges he might face in such a traditional profession. The courtroom doors opened, and a bailiff called out the morning's docket. Marcus listened carefully as case numbers were read, waiting for his turn. Around him, other people shifted nervously, checking their phones and whispering to companions. He noticed how differently people were treated even in these preliminary interactions. Older individuals were addressed as sir and ma'am, while younger people were often ignored or spoken to dismissively. When his case number was finally called, Marcus stood up and walked toward the defendant's table, his heart pounding despite his outward calm. He had argued cases before during law school clinics and internships, but always with the protection of his student status and supervising attorneys. This time he was truly on his own, armed only with his knowledge of the law and his determination to expose whatever biases might exist in the system. The courtroom itself was impressive: high ceilings, dark wood paneling, and the imposing judge's bench that seemed to tower over everyone else in the room. Magistrate Harrison Wells was already seated, a man in his early 60s with silver hair and a stern expression that suggested he had little patience for the parade of minor offenses that filled his daily schedule. He had been on the bench for over 20 years and was known for running an efficient courtroom where cases moved quickly and defendants were expected to show proper respect. As Marcus approached the defendant's table, he could feel the magistrate's eyes on him, sizing him up with the practiced gaze of someone who had seen thousands of young people pass through his courtroom. The assumption was clear in Wells' expression. Here was another careless teenager who had gotten himself into trouble and would now waste the courts. Time with excuses and pleas for leniency. The prosecutor, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a stack of files, barely looked up as she prepared to present the state's case. This was routine for her. Dozens of traffic violations processed each day with mechanical efficiency. She had no way of knowing that the young man, sitting at the defendant's table, possessed a law degree and had already identified several procedural errors in the case file that could lead to a dismissal. Marcus organized his papers and took a deep breath. Preparing himself for what was to come, he knew that the next few minutes would be crucial, not just for the outcome of this particular case, but for the larger experiment he was conducting. Would Magistrate Wells treat him with the same respect accorded to other attorneys, or would his youthful appearance and casual dress invite the kind of dismissive treatment he suspected was all too common in courtrooms across the country? The bailiff called the case to order, and Marcus stood up, ready to begin an experience that would challenge everything he thought he knew about justice, respect, and the presumptions that shape how people are treated within the legal system. Case number 2024 TR 8847 State v. Rodriguez, the bailiff announced in a monotone voice that echoed through the courtroom. Marcus stood up slowly, his hands trembling slightly as he gathered the case files. The fluorescent lights above cast harsh shadows across his face, emphasizing his youthful features and making him look even more out of place in the formal setting. Magistrate Wells looked up from his paperwork with barely concealed irritation, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. His eyes swept over Marcus from head to toe, taking in the wrinkled hoodie, the baseball cap, and the nervous posture. The expression on his face shifted from professional indifference to outright disdain, as if Marcus represented everything wrong with today's youth: disrespectful, unprepared, and wasting the court's valuable time. "Where is your attorney, young man?" Wells asked sharply, his voice cutting through the courtroom like a blade. The question caught Marcus off guard for a moment, even though he had expected it. Several people in the gallery turned to look at him, their expressions ranging from curiosity to pity for the obviously confused teenager who didn't even understand basic court procedures. "Your Honor, I am representing myself in this matter," Marcus replied, keeping his voice steady despite the knot forming in his stomach. He had practiced this moment dozens of times, but the reality of standing before a hostile magistrate was more intimidating than he had anticipated. Wells removed his glasses and leaned back in his chair, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both skepticism and condescension. "Son, do you have any idea what you're doing? This is a court of law, not a playground. If you can't afford an attorney, we can arrange for a public defender. But I strongly advise against representing yourself." The prosecutor, Janet Morrison, shuffled through her files with practiced efficiency, clearly expecting this to be another quick, guilty plea from an overwhelmed defendant. She had seen this scenario play out hundreds of times. Young people who thought they could handle legal matters themselves, only to realize they were completely out of their depth once they stood before a judge. "I understand the charges against me, Your Honor, and I'm prepared to proceed," Marcus said, maintaining the respectful tone that every law student learns in their first year of legal writing courses. However, his youthful appearance made his formal language sound almost comical to those observing from the gallery, like a child playing dress-up in adult clothes. Magistrate Wells sighed heavily and put his glasses back on, making it clear that he viewed the next few minutes as an unfortunate waste of time that could have been better spent on more serious matters. "Very well, Mr." He paused, consulting the file before him. "Mr. Rodriguez? Wait, that's not right." He looked up at Marcus with growing confusion. "What is your name, son?" "Marcus Chen, Your Honor. I'm representing Mr. Rodriguez in this matter." The words hung in the air for a moment as everyone in the courtroom processed what had just been said. The magistrate's expression shifted from confusion to outright disbelief, while murmurs began to ripple through the gallery where other defendants and their families were waiting their turn. "You're telling me you're an attorney?" Wells asked, his voice dripping with skepticism. He leaned forward in his chair, studying Marcus as if he were examining a particularly interesting specimen under a microscope. "How old are you exactly?" The question violated several professional boundaries, but Marcus had expected this line of inquiry. "My age isn't relevant to my ability to represent my client, Your Honor. However, I am 19 years old and a licensed attorney in good standing with the state bar." The courtroom erupted in quiet laughter and whispered comments. Several people shook their heads in disbelief, while others pulled out their phones to capture what they assumed would be an entertaining spectacle. The court reporter's fingers flew across her machine, documenting every word of what was shaping up to be an unusual morning in municipal court. Magistrate Wells's face flushed red with a combination of embarrassment and anger. In his 20 years on the bench, he had never encountered a situation quite like this, and he clearly didn't appreciate being made to look foolish in front of a packed courtroom. The idea that this teenager, who looked like he should be in high school rather than law school, could be a legitimate attorney challenged everything. He thought he knew about the legal profession. "I find that very hard to believe," Wells said coldly. "Do you have any identification proving your status as an attorney?" His tone suggested that he was confident Marcus would be unable to produce such documentation, at which point he could hold him in contempt for lying to the court and wasting everyone's time. Marcus reached into his backpack, another detail that made him look more like a student than a lawyer, and pulled out his bar certification and driver's license. He handed them to the bailiff, who carried them up to the judge's bench. Wells examined the documents carefully, his frown deepening as he realized they appeared to be genuine. These documents seemed to be in order, the magistrate admitted reluctantly, though his tone suggested he still harbored serious doubts. "However, Mr. Chen, your appearance and demeanor are highly inappropriate for this courtroom. The practice of law requires a certain level of professionalism that you clearly haven't mastered." The criticism stung because Marcus knew it was partially true. He had deliberately chosen to dress down for this experiment. But the magistrate's words carried an undertone that went beyond mere dress code violations. There was something personal in the attack, something that seemed to target not just his clothing but his right to be in that courtroom at all. "I apologize if my appearance doesn't meet the court's standards, Your Honor," Marcus replied carefully. "However, I'm prepared to proceed with the case if the court is ready." He opened his file and pulled out several documents that he had prepared the night before, each one meticulously researched and professionally formatted despite his casual appearance. Prosecutor Morrison finally looked up from her own files, realizing that this case might not be the simple guilty plea she had expected. She studied Marcus more carefully now, noting the way he organized his papers and the confident manner in which he spoke, despite his youthful appearance. Something about his demeanor suggested that he might actually know what he was doing, which would make her job considerably more difficult. "Your Honor," Morrison interjected, "regardless of Mr. Chen's credentials, the facts of this case are straightforward. The defendant failed to appear for his initial court date, and the traffic violation is clearly documented by the citing officer." Marcus smiled slightly, the first genuine expression of confidence he had shown since entering the courtroom. This was exactly the opening he had been waiting for, the moment when his real legal training would become apparent to everyone present. The prosecutor had just made a tactical error that any first-year law student would have caught, and Marcus was about to demonstrate that appearances could be very deceiving indeed. "Your Honor, before we proceed with the prosecutor's summary of the facts, I'd like to address several procedural irregularities that I've discovered in the case file," Marcus said, his voice gaining strength and authority as he shifted into full attorney mode. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. His posture straightened, his speech became more precise, and the nervous energy that had marked his earlier responses gave way to calm professionalism. Magistrate Wells raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting this turn of events. "Procedural irregularities? What are you talking about, Mr. Chen?" His tone remained dismissive, but there was now a hint of curiosity mixed with his obvious skepticism. Marcus opened his file and pulled out a series of documents that he had carefully organized with colored tabs and sticky notes. The level of preparation was immediately obvious to everyone in the courtroom, a stark contrast to the disheveled appearance that had initially marked him as an amateur. "First, Your Honor, the original citation was issued on March 15th. But according to the officer's duty roster, Officer Martinez was not scheduled to work that day and was, in fact, on vacation in another state. The prosecutor Morrison frowned and quickly flipped through her own files, her confidence beginning to waver as she realized she hadn't verified this basic information. The case had seemed so routine that she had simply accepted the paperwork at face value, assuming that all the documentation was correct. Now she was beginning to understand that the young man across from her had done his homework in ways that she had not. Furthermore, Marcus continued, warming to his subject as he saw the effect his words were having on the courtroom, the citation indicates that the violation occurred at the intersection of 5th and Main Streets. However, according to city records, construction work was being performed at that location on the date in question, and the intersection was completely closed to traffic from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. A murmur ran through the courtroom as spectators began to realize that this was not going to be the simple case they had expected. Several other attorneys who were waiting for their own cases to be called looked up from their phones and legal pads, intrigued by the unexpected competence being displayed by someone they had initially dismissed as a confused teenager. Magistrate Wells was no longer looking at Marcus with condescension. Instead, his expression had shifted to something resembling professional interest, though he was clearly struggling to reconcile the thorough legal analysis with the youthful appearance of the person presenting it. "Do you have documentation to support these claims, Mr. Chen?" "Yes, Your Honor." Marcus handed a stack of papers to the bailiff, who carried them up to the judge's bench. "I have copies of Officer Martinez's vacation request, approved by his supervisor, as well as photographs of the construction work and the official city closure notice for that intersection. All of these documents are dated and certified." The magistrate examined the papers carefully, his frown deepening as he realized that the young attorney had indeed uncovered serious problems with the prosecution's case. The documentation was thorough, professionally presented, and completely legitimate. Wells had been presiding over traffic court for 2 decades, and he couldn't remember the last time he had seen such meticulous preparation from any attorney, let alone someone who looked like they should still be in high school. Prosecutor Morrison was now frantically searching through her files, trying to find some way to salvage a case that was rapidly falling apart. She had handled thousands of traffic violations, and the vast majority were straightforward affairs where the evidence was clear, and the defendants either pleaded guilty or presented weak defenses that were easily overcome. This situation was unlike anything she had encountered in her career. "Your Honor," Morrison said, her voice betraying her growing concern, "even if there are some irregularities in the paperwork, the defendant still failed to appear for his scheduled court date. That violation stands regardless of the underlying citation." Marcus had been waiting for this argument, and he responded immediately with the kind of legal precision that came from years of study and natural analytical ability. "Actually, Your Honor, my client did attempt to appear for his scheduled court date. However, he was given incorrect information about the court location by a clerk's office employee." He pulled out another document and continued, "This is an affidavit from Mr. Rodriguez stating that he called the clerk's office 3 times to confirm his court date and location. Each time he was told to appear at the downtown courthouse, not this municipal building. When he arrived at the downtown location, he was informed that traffic court was held here, but by then it was too late to make it to the correct courtroom." The affidavit was properly notarized and detailed, showing a level of client preparation that impressed even the skeptical magistrate. Wells had seen countless excuses for missed court dates over the years, but this appeared to be a legitimate case of miscommunication by court personnel, backed up by solid documentation. "I also have phone records showing the calls to the clerk's office," Marcus added, producing yet another set of documents. "The timestamps correspond exactly with my client's statement, and I've identified the specific employee who provided the incorrect information. That employee has since been retrained on proper procedures." The courtroom was now completely silent, except for the soft scratching of the court reporter's machine and the occasional rustle of papers. Everyone present was witnessing something remarkable. A 19-year-old who looked like a college student, systematically dismantling a prosecution case with the skill of a seasoned trial attorney. "Magistrate." Wells leaned back in his chair, studying Marcus with new eyes. The young man before him was clearly not what he appeared to be, and the magistrate was beginning to realize that his initial assumptions had been not only wrong, but potentially embarrassing. Here was someone who had prepared more thoroughly for a simple traffic case than most attorneys prepared for major felony trials. "Mr. Chen," Wells said slowly, his tone much more respectful than it had been at the beginning of the proceedings. "These are serious allegations about procedural errors and miscommunication by court personnel. If what you're saying is true, it raises questions about how this case was handled from the very beginning." "That's correct, Your Honor," Marcus replied. "Given these fundamental problems with both the original citation and the failure to appear charge, I would respectfully request that all charges against my client be dismissed with prejudice." The prosecutor made one last attempt to save her case. "Your Honor, even if we accept Mr. Chen's evidence, perhaps we could reduce the charges or arrange for a plea agreement that takes these circumstances into account." Marcus shook his head firmly. "Your Honor, these aren't minor procedural errors that can be corrected with a reduced charge. The citation was issued by an officer who wasn't even in the state at the time, for a violation that allegedly occurred at a location that was closed to traffic. My client made good faith efforts to comply with court procedures but was given incorrect information by court employees. There is no valid case here to plea bargain." The magistrate looked down at the documents spread across his bench, then back at the young attorney who had just delivered a masterful legal argument. The transformation in the courtroom's atmosphere was complete. Where there had been laughter and dismissive attitudes just minutes before, there was now respectful silence and growing amazement at what they had witnessed. Magistrate Wells stared at the documents before him for what felt like an eternity, the silence in the courtroom growing heavy with anticipation. Finally, he looked up at Marcus, his expression completely transformed from the condescending attitude he had displayed just minutes earlier. The change was so dramatic that several spectators shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing that something significant was happening. "Mr. Chen," the magistrate said slowly, his voice carrying a tone of reluctant respect, "in all my years on this bench, I have rarely seen such thorough preparation and legal analysis. Your documentation appears to be impeccable, and your arguments are sound." He paused, glancing at the prosecutor who was still frantically searching through her files for some way to salvage the case. "However," Wells continued, and Marcus tensed slightly, preparing for whatever objection might be coming, "I'm curious about something. How did a 19-year-old attorney manage to uncover procedural errors that apparently escaped the attention of experienced court personnel and prosecutors?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Marcus realized that this was a crucial moment. The magistrate wasn't just asking about his investigative methods. He was questioning whether someone so young could possibly have the knowledge and skills necessary to practice law at such a high level. The underlying assumption was clear. There had to be some explanation for Marcus's competence that didn't challenge the court's preconceptions about age and ability. "Your Honor," Marcus replied carefully, "I believe that thorough preparation is essential to competent legal representation, regardless of an attorney's age or experience level. When I accepted this case, I reviewed every document, cross-referenced every date, and verified every fact because that's what the law requires and what my client deserves." His words carried a subtle rebuke that wasn't lost on anyone in the courtroom. By emphasizing his thorough preparation, Marcus was implicitly pointing out that others had been less diligent in their duties. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in her chair, realizing that her routine handling of what she had assumed was a simple case was now being exposed as inadequate. Magistrate Wells leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued despite his obvious discomfort with the situation. "Mr. Chen, where exactly did you go to law school? And when did you graduate?" The questions were asked in a tone that suggested the magistrate still couldn't quite believe that someone so young could be legitimately qualified to practice law. "I graduated from State University Law School last spring. Your Honor, I was fortunate to complete my undergraduate degree in 2 years and law school in another 2, which allowed me to take the bar exam at 18. Marcus kept his voice neutral, but he could see the impact his words were having on everyone present. Several people in the gallery exchanged glances of amazement, while others shook their heads in disbelief. The prosecutor finally found her voice. "Your Honor, regardless of Mr. Chen's academic achievements, the state still maintains that some violation occurred, even if the specific details of the citation are in dispute." Her attempt to regain control of the case was weak, and everyone in the courtroom could sense her desperation. Marcus turned slightly to face Morrison directly, his youthful features set in an expression of polite but firm disagreement. Ms. Morrison, with respect, you cannot prosecute some violation without evidence of a specific violation. The citation is fatally flawed because it describes events that physically could not have occurred. My client cannot be held responsible for violations of traffic laws at locations that were closed to traffic by officers who were not present to observe any violations. The legal principle Marcus was invoking was basic but fundamental: the prosecution's burden to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. His articulation of this principle was so clear and confident that even the non-lawyers in the courtroom could understand the logic of his argument. Magistrate Wells rubbed his temples, clearly struggling with a decision that was becoming increasingly obvious, despite his reluctance to reach it. Ms. Morrison, do you have any response to Mr. Chen's evidence regarding the officer's whereabouts and the street closure? The prosecutor looked down at her files one more time, but they both knew she had no counter-evidence to present. No, Your Honor. If Mr. Chen's documentation is accurate, then the state's case has significant problems. The documentation is not only accurate, Your Honor, it's verifiable through multiple independent sources, Marcus said, pressing his advantage while maintaining his respectful demeanor. The officer's vacation records are maintained by the police department. The construction permits are on file with the city planning office, and the street closure was documented by the transportation department. Any of these agencies can confirm the information I've presented. The magistrate was now faced with an unavoidable reality. Despite his initial assumptions about the young man before him, Marcus had presented a devastating critique of the prosecution's case that could not be ignored. To rule against such compelling evidence would not only be legally indefensible, but would also expose the court to potential appeals and criticism. Mr. Chen, Wells said finally, his voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity that hadn't been there before, have you considered what you want to do with your legal career? With skills like these, you could probably work anywhere you wanted. The question was unexpected, and Marcus hesitated before answering. This was not part of his planned experiment, but it offered an opportunity to address the broader issues that had motivated his undercover investigation in the first place. Actually, Your Honor, I've been having difficulty finding employment with established law firms. Many partners seem to feel that someone my age lacks the necessary experience to represent their clients effectively. The irony of the statement was not lost on anyone present. Here was a young attorney who had just demonstrated superior legal skills, while being told by the legal establishment that he wasn't qualified to practice law. The contradiction was so obvious that several people in the gallery chuckled softly. Magistrate Wells looked uncomfortable, perhaps recognizing that his own initial reaction to Marcus had been based on similar prejudices about age and appearance. Well, Mr. Chen, based on what I've witnessed here today, I would say that those law firms are making a serious mistake. The compliment was grudging but genuine, representing a complete reversal from the magistrate's earlier attitude. Marcus nodded politely, but his expression remained serious. The experiment was succeeding beyond his expectations, but it was also revealing uncomfortable truths about how the legal system treated people based on their appearance rather than their abilities. Thank you, Your Honor. I hope that my performance today demonstrates that competence and professionalism are not necessarily correlated with age or appearance. The words were carefully chosen, making his point without being overtly confrontational. The courtroom fell silent again as everyone processed the implications of what had just been said. Marcus had not only won his case, but had also delivered a subtle lecture on the dangers of making assumptions based on superficial characteristics. The lesson was particularly pointed because everyone present had witnessed their own prejudices being challenged and overturned. Magistrate Wells took a deep breath and straightened in his chair, the weight of his decision clearly visible in his expression. The courtroom remained absolutely silent, with every person present understanding that they were witnessing something far more significant than a routine traffic case. The transformation that had occurred over the past 30 minutes went from dismissive, ridicule to grudging respect, represented a profound shift that would be remembered long after the case was closed. After reviewing all the evidence presented by Mr. Chen, Wells began, his voice now carrying the formal authority of judicial pronouncement, and considering the fundamental procedural errors that have been documented, I find that the prosecution has failed to meet its burden of proof. The citation appears to be invalid on its face, and the failure to appear charge is not supported by the evidence. He paused, looking directly at Marcus with an expression that mixed professional respect with personal embarrassment about his earlier behavior.
Therefore, all charges against Mr. Rodriguez are hereby dismissed with prejudice.
The court finds that the defendant made good faith efforts to comply with court procedures, and that any failures were the result of errors by court personnel, not deliberate misconduct by the defendant. The words hit the courtroom like a thunderbolt. Several spectators audibly gasped, while others began whispering excitedly among themselves. The prosecutor slumped in her chair, clearly defeated and probably wondering how she would explain this outcome to her supervisors. Marcus remained standing, his expression neutral despite the surge of satisfaction he felt at having achieved exactly what he had hoped for. "Mr. Chen," the magistrate continued, his tone now completely respectful, "I want to commend you for your exceptional preparation and professional presentation. Your work on this case exemplifies the highest standards of legal advocacy." The praise was genuine, though it clearly cost Wells some effort to deliver it after his earlier dismissive attitude. Marcus nodded graciously. "Thank you, Your Honor. I believe that every client deserves thorough representation, regardless of the nature of their case or the experience level of their attorney." His words carried a subtle emphasis that reminded everyone present about the assumptions that had been made at the beginning of the proceedings. As the bailiff called the next case, Marcus gathered his papers and prepared to leave. However, he noticed that several people in the courtroom were staring at him with expressions ranging from amazement to curiosity. Word of what had happened was already spreading through whispered conversations, and he could see other attorneys looking at him with new interest. As he walked toward the exit, Marcus was intercepted by a well-dressed man in his 50s who had been sitting in the back of the courtroom. "Excuse me, Mr. Chen. My name is Robert Davidson, and I'm a senior partner at Davidson, Walsh & Associates. I couldn't help but observe your performance in there, and I was wondering if you might have a few minutes to talk." The law firm name was familiar to Marcus. Davidson, Walsh & Associates was one of the most prestigious firms in the city, specializing in complex litigation and corporate law. It was exactly the type of firm that had rejected his job applications without even granting him an interview. The irony was not lost on him that he was now being approached by a senior partner from one of those very firms. "Of course, Mr. Davidson," Marcus replied, curious to see where this conversation would lead. They walked to a quiet corner of the courthouse lobby, away from the crowds of people moving between courtrooms. Davidson studied Marcus for a moment, clearly still processing what he had witnessed. "I have to admit, when I first saw you in there, I assumed you were just another young defendant who was in over his head. I was completely wrong, and I apologize for that assumption." The apology was unexpected and seemed genuine, which surprised Marcus. Most senior attorneys he had encountered were not quick to admit their mistakes, especially to someone they perceived as junior to them. "Thank you for saying that, Mr. Davidson. Unfortunately, that kind of initial assumption seems to be fairly common in our profession." "You're absolutely right, and it's something our profession needs to address," Davidson agreed. "What you accomplished in that courtroom was remarkable, not just the legal analysis but the way you handled yourself under pressure. Magistrate Wells can be particularly difficult with young attorneys, and you managed to completely turn the situation around." Marcus was beginning to understand where this conversation was heading, but he wanted to hear Davidson say it explicitly. "I appreciate your kind words. It was certainly a challenging situation, but thorough preparation made all the difference." Davidson smiled, recognizing the subtle way Marcus was emphasizing the importance of judging people by their work, rather than their appearance. "Mr. Chen, I'm going to be direct with you. Our firm has been looking for bright young talent, and what I witnessed today convinced me that we've been looking in the wrong places. Would you be interested in discussing a position with our litigation team?" The offer was exactly what Marcus had been hoping to achieve through conventional channels, but now it felt somewhat hollow. He had proven his abilities, but only after subjecting himself to ridicule and conducting an elaborate deception. "That's a very generous offer, Mr. Davidson. However, I'm curious, would you have been interested in me if you had simply reviewed my resume without seeing today's performance?" The question was pointed, and Davidson had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Honestly, Probably not. A 19-year-old with no work experience would have been automatically screened out by our recruitment process. That's clearly a flaw in our system that we need to address. At least he was being honest, Marcus thought. The admission confirmed everything he had suspected about the legal profession's bias against young attorneys, regardless of their qualifications or abilities. I appreciate your honesty, Mr. Davidson. It raises some important questions about how our profession evaluates talent and potential. Indeed it does, Davidson agreed. Which is why I think you could help us change those practices. Someone with your skills and perspective could make a significant contribution to our firm and to the legal profession as a whole. Marcus considered the offer carefully. On one hand, this was exactly the kind of opportunity he had been seeking. A chance to work with experienced attorneys on complex cases and to build a successful legal career. On the other hand, accepting the position would feel like validating a system that judged people based on prejudice rather than merit. Mr. Davidson, I'm definitely interested in discussing this further. However, I think there are some broader issues we should address about how law firms evaluate and treat young attorneys. What happened in that courtroom today shouldn't have been necessary to demonstrate basic professional competence. Davidson nodded thoughtfully. You're absolutely right. Perhaps we could use your experience to help develop better recruitment and evaluation practices. Would you be willing to share your story with our partners and help us understand how we can do better? The request intrigued Marcus. Here was an opportunity not just to advance his own career, but to potentially change how the legal profession treated young attorneys more broadly. If his undercover experiment could lead to systemic improvements in hiring practices and professional attitudes, then the embarrassment and stress he had endured would have served a greater purpose. I would be very interested in that conversation, Mr. Davidson. However, I think it's important that you understand what really happened here today. Marcus paused, choosing his words carefully. This wasn't just a lucky break or exceptional preparation. This was a deliberate experiment to test whether the legal system treats young people fairly, regardless of their qualifications. Davidson's eyebrows rose in surprise. An experiment? What do you mean? I mean that I deliberately dressed down and presented myself as younger and less experienced than I actually am, specifically to see how I would be treated in court. The results were exactly what I expected. Initial dismissal, condescension, and assumptions about my competence based entirely on my appearance. The revelation clearly shocked Davidson, who stared at Marcus with a mixture of admiration and concern. You deliberately subjected yourself to that kind of treatment as an experiment? That's either very brave or very foolish. Maybe both, Marcus admitted with a slight smile, but I needed to understand whether the barriers I was facing in finding employment were part of a broader pattern of discrimination against young attorneys. Today confirmed that they are. Davidson was quiet for a moment, processing the implications of what Marcus had told him. So the magistrate's behavior wasn't just typical judicial impatience, it was age-based prejudice that you were deliberately trying to expose. Exactly. And it worked perfectly. Magistrate Wells made assumptions about my competence based on my age and appearance that were completely contradicted by my actual performance. The question is, whether the legal profession is willing to examine and change those patterns of bias. The conversation was taking on a significance that neither man had anticipated when it began. What had started as a job offer was evolving into a discussion about fundamental problems within the legal system and potential solutions for addressing them. Mr. Chen, I have to say that you're happy. 6 months later, Marcus stood before a packed auditorium at the State Bar Association's annual conference, looking out at an audience of hundreds of attorneys, judges, and legal professionals. Unlike that morning in municipal court, he was now dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit, his appearance commanding immediate respect from the distinguished gathering. However, the confidence he displayed had nothing to do with his clothes and everything to do with the journey that had brought him to this moment. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice carrying clearly through the large space. 6 months ago, I conducted an experiment that fundamentally changed how I understand our profession. Today I want to share that experience with you and discuss what it revealed about bias, assumptions, and the barriers we create for young attorneys entering our field. The audience was attentive, though many had already heard rumors about the young lawyer who had exposed prejudice in municipal court through an elaborate undercover operation. Marcus had become something of a celebrity within legal circles, not just for his courtroom victory, but for the broader conversation his experiment had sparked about age discrimination in the legal profession. Behind him on the stage sat a panel that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. Magistrate Harrison Wells, who had initially ridiculed Marcus in court, was now one of his strongest advocates for judicial reform. Robert Davidson had become not just his employer, but a collaborator in developing new hiring practices for law firms. Even prosecutor Janet Morrison was present, having become an unexpected ally in pushing for better training and case preparation standards. When I walked into courtroom B that morning, Marcus continued, I deliberately presented myself in a way that would trigger every prejudice and assumption that exists about young people in legal settings. I wore a hoodie and baseball cap, spoke casually, and acted nervous and unprepared. The response was exactly what I expected: immediate dismissal, condescension, and the assumption that I couldn't possibly be a legitimate attorney. A murmur ran through the audience as lawyers recognized their own potential biases in Marcus's description. Many of them had probably made similar assumptions about young defendants or attorneys in their own practices, and his words forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about their professional attitudes. But here's what made the experiment truly revealing, Marcus said, advancing to the next slide in his presentation. My qualifications didn't change during that court hearing. My legal training didn't change. My preparation didn't change. The only thing that changed was how people perceive those qualifications once they were forced to confront the evidence of my competence. The slide behind him showed statistics that his research had uncovered, data about hiring practices at major law firms, judicial attitudes toward young attorneys, and client preferences based on attorney age and appearance. The numbers painted a clear picture of systematic bias that extended far beyond his individual experience. Magistrate Wells leaned forward to the microphone at the panel table. I want to be very clear about something, he said, his voice carrying the authority of his years on the bench. Mr. Chen's presentation that morning was the most thorough and professional legal argument I had seen in months of traffic court. Yet I initially dismissed him because of his appearance and age. That's not just unfair. It's a failure of judicial responsibility. The admission was powerful coming from a sitting judge, and it sparked vigorous note-taking throughout the audience. Wells had agreed to participate in the panel specifically to acknowledge his role in the incident and to advocate for changes in judicial training and awareness. The question, Marcus continued, is not whether these biases exist. My experiment proved that they do. The question is what we're going to do about them. How do we create a legal profession that evaluates people based on their abilities rather than their appearance or age? Robert Davidson stood up from the panel to address this challenge directly. At Davidson Walsh & Associates, we've completely overhauled our recruitment process based on what we learned from Marcus's experience. We now conduct initial interviews without seeing photographs or age information, focusing entirely on legal knowledge and analytical skills. The results have been remarkable. We're identifying talented candidates we would have overlooked under our old system. The presentation continued for another 30 minutes, with Marcus detailing specific recommendations for law firms, courts, and bar associations. He proposed blind resume reviews, standardized competency assessments, and mandatory bias training for all legal professionals. Each suggestion was backed by research and real-world examples from firms that had already begun implementing changes. During the question and answer session, a senior partner from a prestigious corporate firm stood up. Mr. Chen, while your experiment was certainly eye-opening, don't you think clients have legitimate concerns about being represented by very young attorneys? Experience does matter in legal practice. Marcus had anticipated this question and was ready with a measured response. You're absolutely right that experience matters. However, we need to distinguish between relevant experience and assumptions based on age. A 19-year-old with strong legal training and thorough preparation may be more effective than a 40-year-old who hasn't kept up with current law or who approaches cases carelessly. We should evaluate attorneys based on their actual competence, not their birth date. The response drew applause from younger attorneys in the audience, many of whom had faced similar challenges in establishing their careers. Marcus's success had given them hope that the profession might be changing in ways that would benefit them directly. As the presentation concluded, Marcus reflected on how much had changed since that morning in municipal court. His law practice was thriving, with clients specifically seeking him out because of his reputation for thorough preparation and innovative thinking. More importantly, his experiment had sparked a broader movement for reform within the legal profession. "Change is never easy," he said in his closing remarks, "but it's necessary if we want our profession to truly serve justice rather than perpetuate prejudice." Today's young attorneys are tomorrow's judges, prosecutors, and law firm partners. How we treat them now will determine what kind of legal system we have in the future. The standing ovation that followed was sustained and enthusiastic, reflecting not just appreciation for Marcus's presentation, but recognition that he had initiated something much larger than a single courtroom victory. As he left the stage, Marcus knew that his experiment had achieved its ultimate goal, not just exposing bias, but creating the momentum necessary to address it systematically. The journey that began with a humiliating experience in municipal court had evolved into a crusade for professional reform that would benefit countless young attorneys for years to come. Sometimes, Marcus reflected, the most important victories are won not by conforming to a broken system, but by having the courage to expose its flaws and demand something better.